In 1839, on a plantation where life was measured by labor and profit, an enslaved mother gave birth to 3 children at once. To the world outside the slave quarters, it should have been called a miracle. Instead, it became a calculation. What followed was not a choice made in love or cruelty, but a decision forced by a system that demanded survival at any cost and left one child alive, carrying the weight of 2 silences. The night the children were born did not arrive with thunder or warning, but with a heat so heavy it pressed against the lungs like a hand. The air in the slave quarters had been still all evening, thick with the smell of damp earth, sweat, and boiled cornmeal, the kind of night when even breathing felt like labor. Women moved quietly, instinctively, because childbirth under slavery was never just a private moment between a mother and her body. It was an event watched by the system, counted by it, and judged by what would come next. The mother had been in pain since before sunset, her body tightening and loosening in waves that felt endless, her hands gripping the thin mattress beneath her as she tried not to cry out too loudly. Sound traveled too easily on plantations at night. Sound brought attention, attention brought consequences. When the midwife arrived, she did not announce herself, she slipped inside like a shadow, carrying knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned to deliver life in conditions that never welcomed it. At first, everything seemed ordinary in the grim way that slavery defined ordinary. The labor was long, the mother was exhausted, sweat soaked her dress, and her breath came in broken gasps, but no one was surprised. Then the first child arrived, small but breathing, its cry sharp and sudden in the dark. The sound froze the room for a moment. A cry meant life, but it also meant notice. The midwife wrapped the baby quickly, pressing a finger gently against its mouth to soften the sound, and murmured a prayer under her breath. Relief barely had time to settle before the second wave came, stronger than the first, tearing through the mother's body with a pain so deep it felt like something inside her was breaking. The midwife's hands paused, her eyes changed. This was not supposed to happen again so soon. When the second child came, smaller, weaker, its cry thinner, the air in the room shifted from tension to fear. No one spoke, but everyone understood. 2 babies were already dangerous. 2 babies meant longer recovery, delayed return to work, more attention from overseers who measured productivity with cruelty. The mother's face was pale now, her strength draining fast, but before anyone could even process what had happened, her body convulsed again, involuntarily, violently, as if refusing to stop. The midwife whispered something sharp and urgent. A third child emerged, fragile, barely moving, its chest fluttering like a trapped bird. For a long moment no one breathed. 3 triplets. The word itself was never spoken aloud, because to name it was to summon what followed. The room filled with a silence heavier than screams, the kind of silence that comes when joy is swallowed by terror. Outside, the plantation slept, unaware that something had happened that would ripple through its rigid order by morning. Inside, the women exchanged looks that said everything words could not. 3 infants were not a blessing here. They were a problem. The mother lay there shaking, not from cold, but from the shock settling into her bones, her mind struggling to understand what her body had done. She reached instinctively toward the children, her fingers brushing tiny limbs, and for one fleeting second, there was love. Pure, overwhelming, uncontested. But love under slavery never existed alone. It was always followed by fear. Someone whispered that the overseer would notice the delay in work. Someone else murmured that the master would not allow it. The midwife's hands trembled as he worked, not from lack of skill, but from knowing too well how this plantation handled anything that disrupted its rhythm. Babies were future labor, yes, but only if they survived cheaply, quietly, and on the plantation's terms. Weak infants were liabilities. Multiple infants were risks, and a mother who could not return to the fields quickly was seen not as a human recovering from childbirth, but as an inconvenience. The cries, soft, uneven, desperate, felt too loud even when they barely rose above a whisper. Every sound seemed to echo in the mother's chest like a warning bell. She knew the rules without ever being taught them. She knew that by sunrise, eyes would turn toward her cabin. Questions would be asked that were not really questions. Calculations would be made by men who never entered the slave quarters unless there was punishment to deliver. As the midwife cleaned the children and laid them beside her, the mother stared at the ceiling, tears sliding silently into her hair. because joy and dread had fused into something unbearable. She did not ask what would happen next, because deep down she already knew. Survival on a plantation was never about what was right, it was about what was allowed. And in that moment, as her 3 children breathed unevenly beside her, the mother understood that the most terrifying part of the night was not the pain she had just endured, but the morning that was coming. Before the sun could rise over the fields, before the bells could ring to call the enslaved back to work, a miracle had already been turned into a dilemma by the machinery of slavery. And before we go any further into what this night set into motion, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the end, because stories like this were buried on purpose. And when it's over, leave a comment telling us how deeply this history affected you, so the silence that once surrounded it does not return. The time the sky began to pale from black to a bruised gray, the cabin felt smaller than it had hours before, as if the walls themselves were leaning inward to listen. The mother had not slept, her body would not allow it, her mind even less so. Each breath the babies took sounded fragile, borrowed, like time itself had been thinned for them. The midwife remained seated near the door, not out. By mid-morning the master knew. He arrived with the air of a man inconvenienced, his boots clean, his coat buttoned despite the rising heat, his eyes already measuring loss before he measured life. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked down, not at the mother's face, but at the bundles beside her, his expression flattening as if the numbers alone offended him. He asked no questions about her pain, her bleeding, her strength. He asked only how many had survived the night. When told 3, he exhaled through his nose, the way men did when livestock surprised them. His calculations were quick and cold, spoken aloud as if they were facts of weather rather than choices. 3 infants would keep a woman from productive labor too long, 3 mouths would drain resources, 3 weak starts would likely end in sickness that spread. He spoke of sense and order, of not letting sentiment interfere with efficiency, and every word landed on the mother's chest like a weight. She tried to sit up, to speak, to claim her children with the only authority she had, her voice. But the midwife placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, not to silence her, but to keep her from saying something that could not be taken back. The master's gaze lingered on the smallest child, the one whose breath fluttered, whose skin seemed almost translucent in the light that crept through the cracks in the wall. He said nothing about it directly, but his meaning was clear to everyone in the room. Hard choices were sometimes necessary, he said, to preserve the strongest stock. The language was deliberate, dehumanizing by design, a reminder that on this land, children were not born into families but into inventories. When he left, the door closing behind him with finality, the room did not erupt into argument or tears. It fell into a deeper silence, one that carried the unspoken burden of what would now be expected. The midwife sank onto a stool, her shoulders sagging as if she had aged years in minutes. She had seen this before, though never with such cruelty compressed into a single morning. Women whispered prayers that asked for impossible mercy, not from the master but from time, from sickness to spare one, from strength to rise in another, from chance to intervene where choice would destroy. The mother stared at her children, her mind splintering into competing instincts, to shield them all, to bargain with fate, to beg, to fight, to run. But where could she go? Escape with 1 infant was already a gamble, with 3 it was a death sentence. As the heat climbed, the babies stirred, and their cries, soft, uneven, drew anxious glances toward the door, because sound invited scrutiny. The women took turns holding them, trying to soothe without bonding too deeply, an act that felt like betrayal even as it was framed as protection. In the afternoon, the overseer returned, with instructions delivered as if they were inevitable outcomes rather than commands. The mother would be expected back to light work sooner than usual. Provisions would not be increased. Nature, he said, had a way of resolving excess. The implication was a knife pressed just close enough to the skin to draw blood without leaving a mark. When he left again, the midwife closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing her face to crumple, because she knew the burden had shifted from men who spoke of efficiency to women who would be forced to carry out the consequences. The mother reached for the smallest child and held it against her chest, feeling the faint warmth, the fragile insistence of life. She whispered names, not official ones, not the kind that appeared in ledgers, but names that carried hope, memory, and lineage. She whispered them all the same, because to name was to claim, even if only for a moment. As evening approached, the light softened, and with it came the unbearable clarity that dawn had deferred. Choices would be demanded without being asked, and whatever happened would be framed as inevitability rather than violence. The women gathered close, forming a circle that excluded the world outside, their bodies a barrier, their presence a quiet declaration that this moment belonged to them, even if the consequences would not. The mother's heart hammered with a ferocity that surprised her, because beneath the grief and fear, something else had taken root. A fierce, desperate resolve to ensure that at least one of her children would not be claimed by this place. She did not yet know how that resolve would be tested, or what price it would demand, but as night fell again over the fields, she understood with terrifying clarity that survival here was never evenly distributed. It was chosen, forced, negotiated in shadows, and the next hours would decide which life would be allowed to continue under the sun, and which would be swallowed by the silence the plantation required. Night returned with a weight that felt deliberate, as if darkness itself had been instructed to press harder this time, to leave no room for illusion. The cabin was lit by a single low flame that bent and shivered with every movement, throwing shadows that stretched and collapsed against the walls like living things. The women had not dispersed. They stayed, some seated, some standing, some crouched near the children, because leaving felt like abandonment and staying felt like complicity, yet none of them could imagine being anywhere else. The mother lay propped against a thin pillow, her body aching in places she could no longer separate from one another, her arms trembling from exhaustion as she held the smallest child close, counting each shallow breath as if numbers alone could anchor it to the world. The other two slept fitfully beside her, their faces relaxed in a way that felt almost cruel, unaware of the calculations being made around them. No one spoke at first, because speech had a way of making things real, and reality was already too sharp. The midwife finally broke the silence, not with instructions, but with a story. One from years ago, another plantation, another impossible choice framed as fate. She spoke softly, carefully, her words winding through the room like smoke, reminding them that the system thrived on isolation, on forcing women to believe they were alone in their suffering. She did not tell them what to do, she could not, but she made clear what the plantation expected would happen if nothing was done, how neglect could be mistaken for nature, how silence could be weaponized against grief. The mother listened, her face still, but inside her something raged, because she understood the cruel genius of it all. No hand needed to strike, no order needed to be written. The system would simply wait. As hours passed, the smallest child's breathing grew more erratic, tiny pauses stretching just long enough to steal the breath from everyone watching. Each pause felt like an accusation, as if the child itself were asking why love was not enough. The women took turns rocking, humming low melodies that had crossed oceans and generations, songs meant to steady spirits rather than entertain ears. The mother whispered prayers that did not ask for miracles anymore, only for clarity, only for forgiveness she was not sure she deserved. Sometime near midnight, footsteps approached again, slower this time, more deliberate. The overseer did not enter. He lingered just long enough to remind them he was there, that this space was never truly private. His presence was a reminder that any visible struggle would be interpreted as defiance, any noise as disorder. When he left, the midwife closed the door with shaking hands and turned to the mother, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. She spoke plainly now, stripped of metaphor, because time had run out. If all three remained here, none might survive the scrutiny, the lack of care, the forced return to labor. Illness would come, she said, as it always did. Hunger would follow. But if one Hild could be hidden, sent away under the guise of nursing elsewhere, claimed by another woman temporarily, there was a chance. Small, fragile, but real. The mother felt the words settle like stones in her stomach. Hidden meant separated, sent away meant unknown. but chance was more than the plantation ever offered. Her gaze moved between the children, her heart breaking anew with each shift, because love did not divide neatly, did not rank itself by strength or size. Yet the world they lived in did. The women waited, not pressuring her, not urging her, because they knew the cruelty of being rushed into grief. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely sound, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. She said the name of the child who breathed strongest, whose cry had been sharpest, whose warmth lingered longest against her skin. She did not say it because she loved that child more, she said it because she loved them all enough to choose survival over symmetry. What followed was not ceremony but quiet coordination, women moving with practiced efficiency born of generations, forced to do the unthinkable for the sake of the living. Cloth was gathered, plans whispered, routes imagined that avoided eyes and questions. The smallest child slept against her chest, its breath shallow but present, and she memorized the feel of it, the weight, the warmth, the way its fingers curled reflexively around hers. Dawn crept closer, indifferent, and with it came the understanding that whatever happened next would mark her forever. When the time came, there were no dramatic gestures, no final speeches. There was only the mother's kiss pressed gently against a tiny forehead, a breath held too long, a hand lingering even after it should have released. The women around her absorbed her grief without comment, forming a wall that kept it from spilling outward where it could be used against her. As the first hint of light slipped through the cracks, the cabin returned to stillness, but it was a different stillness now, one shaped by absence. The plantation woke as it always did, bells ringing, orders shouted, labor resumed, and to the outside world nothing had changed. Inside the mother, everything had. She lay there, empty in ways no ledger could record, her body sore, her arms aching with a phantom weight, her heart torn between relief and devastation. She had done what the system demanded without ever saying so, and that truth would haunt her long after the details blurred. Yet beneath the grief, there was a fragile thread of hope, pulled tight but unbroken, because somewhere beyond the reach of this place, one of her children might grow without knowing the sound of chains or the taste of fear. That possibility was both her comfort and her punishment, a reminder that survival under slavery was never clean, never whole, and never free from cost. Morning arrived without mercy, the sun lifting itself over the fields as if nothing extraordinary had taken place in the night, as if the earth had not just absorbed a decision that would echo for the rest of a woman's life. The bell rang as it always did, sharp and commanding, slicing through the thin air of dawn and pulling bodies from whatever fragments of rest they had managed to gather. In the cabin, the mother lay still, her eyes open, her gaze fixed on a place just beyond the wall where her thoughts had gone to hide. Her body throbbed with pain now that the urgency of the night had passed, every muscle reminding her that she had given birth not once, but 3 times, and then had done something far more violent without ever lifting a hand. The 2 remaining infants stirred beside her, their small noises grounding her in the present even as her mind threatened to drift into the unbearable. Women moved around her quietly, not lingering, because mourning demanded explanations, demanded order, demanded that grief be folded away like an extra cloth. One of them lifted the children gently and pressed them back against their mother's sides, arranging the scene so that it matched what the overseer expected to see. A woman who had delivered twins, nothing more, nothing less. The third absence hung in the room like a withheld breath, invisible but unmistakable to those who knew it was there. When the overseer returned, his eyes swept the space with professional indifference, counting bodies the way he always did, and when he saw only 2, something like relief passed across his face, not for the mother, not for the children, but for the restoration of balance as he understood it. He said nothing about the missing child, because saying nothing was easier, because silence allowed him to claim that nature had intervened, that no human hand had been involved, that the system remained clean. He reminded the mother she would be expected to rise soon, perhaps not to the fields immediately, but to lighter work, and then he left, satisfied that the disruption had resolved itself. As his footsteps faded, the mother turned her face into the thin pillow and allowed herself for the first time to cry, not loudly, not openly, but with a quiet shaking that racked her body from within. The women did not rush to stop her. They knew tears were a debt that had to be paid eventually. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small tasks and forced normalcy. Food was brought, eaten mechanically. The infants were nursed, their mouths rooting instinctively, unaware of the calculus that had spared them. Each time the mother held them, love surged alongside guilt so sharp it made her chest ache. She watched their faces for signs of weakness, of illness, terrified that even after everything, the plantation would still take one more from her, rendering the sacrifice meaningless. Word spread quietly, reshaped as it traveled, until by evening the quarters had accepted the story it was meant to tell. That a woman had given birth to twins, that one had been frail but survived, that life went on. But beneath that story lived another, one that passed only through glances and pauses and the way hands lingered just a second longer than necessary. The women who knew carried it carefully because of the occasion that kept her moving forward. She did not speak of the night again, not openly, but it lived on in the way she held her children closer than most, in the way she flinched when illness passed through the quarters, in the way she watched the world with an alertness sharpened by loss. The plantation would never record what truly happened, but within the community of the enslaved, the truth remained, passed down not as a tale of horror, but as a testament to the impossible decisions forced upon mothers who loved too fiercely to do nothing at all. Time did not heal what had been done, but it did change the way the wound lived inside her, turning something raw and bleeding into something harder, quieter, carried like a stone in the chest that made every breath a conscious act. Months passed, then a year, and the plantation settled into a rhythm that pretended permanence, as if repetition alone could erase memory. The mother learned how to move through her days with practiced calm, her face composed, her hands steady as she worked, because she understood now that survival depended not only on endurance, but on appearing unbroken. The two children grew stronger, their cries becoming laughter, their fragile beginnings fading into the ordinary resilience demanded of every enslaved child born into labor. Each time they reached a milestone, sitting up, taking their first steps, forming sounds that would one day become words, joy rose in her chest alongside a grief that never quite loosened its grip. She celebrated quietly, afraid that too much happiness might tempt the world to take something else from her, because loss had taught her that joy was never protected here. At night, when the quarters were still and the plantation's authority retreated into sleep, she allowed herself to remember more freely. She imagined the third child not as it had been, small, struggling, vulnerable, but as it might be now, stronger with time, carried by another woman's arms, perhaps learning a different rhythm of life beyond this land. She told herself stories where the child was safe, because hope, even when imagined, was the only thing that kept despair from hollowing her out completely. The women around her watched with a quiet respect that bordered on reverence, because they understood the cost of what she carried and the strength it took to keep going. They helped where they could, sharing food when rations ran thin, watching the children when she was called away, creating a network of care that existed in defiance of a system designed to isolate. The midwife remained a presence in her life, checking on the children's health, offering counsel, reminding her through small gestures that she was not alone in her memory. Yet even within this support, there were moments when the weight pressed too heavily, when a sound, a baby crying in another cabin, a lullaby hummed by a passing woman, sent a sharp ache through her, dragging her back to that night she could never fully leave. The plantation itself seemed unchanged, overseers coming and going, orders barked, punishments delivered with bureaucratic cruelty, but beneath the surface something subtle had shifted in her. She no longer believed in the illusion that obedience alone ensured survival. She had seen how quickly the system demanded sacrifices, how it framed violence as inevitability, and that knowledge hardened her resolve to protect what she could, however quietly, however imperfectly. When sickness moved through the quarters, she became vigilant, cleaning obsessively, guarding her children's health with a ferocity born of knowing how easily life could slip away. When rumors of sale circulated, she listened carefully, storing information, preparing herself mentally for losses she could not prevent, but could at least anticipate. Her relationship with the plantation's authority became one of careful navigation, Rather than submission, she learned when to speak, and when silence was safer, when to blend into the background, and when to draw attention away from those more vulnerable. In this way, the night of the birth reshaped her, not just as a mother, but as a strategist of survival. The children sensed something of this even without understanding it, growing up under her watchful eye, absorbing lessons not spoken aloud, how to read moods, how to move without attracting notice, how to cling to one another in a world that profited from separation. As they grew, she told them stories, coded ones, layered with meaning, about strength, about choices, about the importance of looking out for each other. She did not tell them about the third child. That truth felt too heavy to place on shoulders not yet strong enough to bear it. But she carried it for them, letting it inform the way she loved them fiercely, protectively, because love here was not gentle, it was vigilant. Occasionally, whispers reached her from beyond the plantation, news of other births, other losses, other women forced into impossible decisions, and each story reaffirmed what she already knew. Her pain was not unique, but that did not make it lighter. It made it collective, woven into a larger tapestry of suffering and resilience that defined enslaved motherhood. As years passed, the memory of the night did not fade, but it transformed, becoming less a moment of terror and more a foundation upon which she built her understanding of the world. She did not forgive the system that forced her hand. Forgiveness felt like surrender. Instead, she carried a quiet defiance, expressed not in rebellion that would be crushed, but in the stubborn insistence on her children's humanity, in the refusal to let the plantation's logic fully claim her heart. In this way, part 5 of her story was not about resolution, but about endurance, about learning to live with the consequences of a choice made under duress, about finding meaning not in what was lost, but in what survived, and about the slow, unglamorous heroism of continuing to care, to love, and to hope, in a place that offered no protection for any of those things. As the children grew into early childhood, the plantation began to notice them not as miracles that had survived against odds, but as bodies that would one day be counted, measured, and worked, and that realization brought a new layer of fear into the mother's already crowded heart. Their small hands, once curled helplessly around her fingers, now reached for tools, for scraps of food, for each other, and every sign of growth carried with it the shadow of what that growth would mean. She watched them learn to walk the narrow paths between cabins, watched them mimic the movements of older children who already understood how to stay out of the way, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever innocence brushed too closely against the plantation's expectations. The memory of the night they were born remained a constant undercurrent, shaping how she interpreted every change, every threat, every rumor that drifted through the quarters. When talk of debts reached the cabins, when whispers of sales passed from mouth to mouth, she felt the old panic rise, because she knew how quickly children could be taken, how little protection a mother's presence offered once decisions were made beyond her control. She began to plan in small, quiet ways, storing knowledge the way others stored food, learning which overseers were cruelest, which days' inspections were likely, which paths were least watched. The women around her did the same, sharing information in fragments that, when assembled, formed a fragile shield. They had learned that survival depended on foresight, on seeing danger before it arrived, because once it did, resistance often came too late. The midwife aged visibly during these years, her hair graying, her movements slower, but her role remained essential. She continued to deliver children, to tend the sick, to counsel women whose bodies were never teach, ear own, and she continued to check on the mother, her visits carrying unspoken acknowledgement of a bond forged in crisis. Together, they watched the children grow, noting their strengths, their temperaments, their vulnerabilities, and discussing quietly what paths might offer them the greatest chance of survival when the plantation began to demand more from them. The mother's fear was no longer acute and overwhelming as it had been in those first weeks. It had settled into something steadier, more strategic, a vigilance that never fully relaxed. She taught her children not just obedience but awareness, how to read the faces of white men, how to recognize when silence was safer than speech, how to stay close to one another when fear crept in. She did not frame these lessons as warnings, but as stories, as games, as guidance wrapped in love, because she refused to let the plantation steal her children's sense of being cared for, even as it prepared to exploit their labor. Occasionally, moments of almost normalcy pierced the heaviness, shared laughter among the children, songs sung softly in the evening, the simple comfort of bodies pressed together against the cold. These moments were precious precisely because they were temporary, because she knew how quickly they could be interrupted, and always, beneath these moments, lingered the presence of the child who was not there, a silent companion to her thoughts, a reminder of the cost of every decision she made. She wondered often whether that child would one day return in some form, through rumor, through chance, through a face glimpsed in a crowd beyond the plantation, but she did not allow herself to dwell too long on such thoughts, because hope, untethered from reality, could become another kind of pain. The plantation itself grew harsher as the years passed, pressures mounting from markets and politics far beyond the fields, pressures that translated into longer hours, stricter oversight, less tolerance for any disruption. The mother felt this tightening acutely, sensing that the fragile balance she had maintained could easily be shattered. When one of her children fell ill, even briefly, fear surged back with full force, memories of frailty and loss flooding her mind, and she hovered relentlessly until the danger passed. These scares reinforced what she already knew. Survival here was never guaranteed, never permanent, and every day lived was a small victory won against an unyielding system. As the children approached the age when work would be expected of them, the mother's internal calculations grew more complex. She weighed the dangers of visibility against the dangers of weakness, knowing that standing out could invite cruelty, but falling behind could invite punishment. She navigated these contradictions with the same quiet resolve that had guided her through the night of the birth, choosing carefully, adjusting constantly, because motherhood under slavery was an ongoing negotiation with forces determined to strip it of meaning. In this phase of her life, grief and love were no longer opposites. They were intertwined, each informing the other. The loss she carried sharpened her love, made it more deliberate, more protective, while her love kept the grief from consuming her entirely. Part 6 of her story then was about adaptation, about how a woman, forced into an impossible choice, learned to live in its aftermath not by forgetting, but by transforming pain into vigilance, memory into guidance, and loss into a fierce commitment to keep the lives she still held as safe as this world would allow. As the children crossed the fragile threshold between early childhood and usefulness in the eyes of the plantation, the mother felt time closing in around her like a tightening snare, each passing season bringing them closer to being claimed not just in theory, but in practice. The day one of them was first told to carry water instead of play, to stand still instead of wander, mark. A quiet but devastating shift that no bell announced and no ledger needed to record, because every enslaved person knew the moment when childhood began to end. The mother watched from a distance, her hands busy with work as her eyes tracked their small figures, learning how to be careful, learning how to be invisible when necessary, learning how to survive attention without being broken by it. Pride and terror braided themselves together inside her because she could not deny the strength in their growing bodies or the intelligence in their eyes, yet she knew those very qualities could make them targets. She became even more precise in her guidance, correcting small behaviors gently but firmly, reminding them, always in coded ways, to stay together, to listen more than they spoke, to come to her immediately if something felt wrong. Her voice never carried panic. Panic could be smelled by those who preyed on it. Instead, she spoke with calm authority, the kind that reassured children even as it prepared them for dangers she could not fully explain. Around them, the plantation's cruelty continued its slow grind, claiming others with the same indifference it had shown on the night of the birth. Children disappeared into other households, women returned from the big house, changed in ways that needed no words. Men were punished publicly to reinforce lessons meant for everyone. Each loss rippled through the quarters, reinforcing the understanding that nothing was permanent except vulnerability. The mother absorbed these lessons and adapted, building routines that created small islands of safety, shared meals eaten close together, bedtime rituals that anchored the children even when the world outside felt unstable, stories told in whispers that carried lessons of resilience and care. Sometimes, late at night, when the children slept pressed against her sides, she allowed herself to revisit the memory of the third child with a clarity she avoided during the day. She wondered what age it would be now, what shape its face might have taken, whether it had inherited her eyes or the quickness of its siblings. She imagined it growing somewhere beyond this plantation's reach, perhaps still enslaved, perhaps not, but at least spared the particular web of danger that surrounded her remaining children. That imagining was both solace and sorrow, because it reminded her that even the most loving choice under slavery could never be exhaustion of carrying so much responsibility alone, when the accumulated weight of vigilance and memory threatened to pull her under, but she did not allow herself to collapse. Collapse was a luxury the plantation would not grant her. Instead, she leaned into routine, into the small certainties she could control, finding steadiness in repetition even as the future loomed uncertain. By the time the children reached the cusp of adolescence, the mother understood with painful clarity that her role was shifting again. She could no longer shield them as completely as she once had. The world would soon demand things from them that no amount of preparation could fully soften. Still, she held fast to the belief that what she had given them, the awareness, the closeness, the sense of being fiercely loved, would matter. It would shape how they moved through danger, how they understood themselves when the plantation tried to reduce them to property. Part 7 of her story, then, was about transition and reckoning, about watching the future approach with eyes wide open, carrying the memory of one child lost as both a wound and a warning, and continuing, despite everything, to choose care in a world that punished it at every turn. The years that followed did not bring the kind of ending stories often promise, with justice neatly delivered or wounds cleanly closed, but they did bring a reckoning that unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, in the way lives shaped themselves around what had been endured. As the children stepped fully into adolescence, the mother watched them move with a confidence that startled her at times, not because they were fearless, but because they had learned how to carry fear without letting it announce itself. They worked now. Their labor folded into the plantation's endless appetite, their bodies no longer protected by youth, their days governed by the same bells and orders that had ruled her own life for as long as she could remember. Each morning she watched them leave the cabin with a tightening in her chest that never eased, and each evening she counted their returns with silent relief, knowing too well that not everyone came back. The memory of the third child, absent, unnamed in any record, alive only in her heart, became a quiet compass by which she measured everything that followed. It reminded her that survival was never guaranteed, that every day together was provisional, and that love under slavery was an act of resistance precisely because it persisted despite that knowledge. She saw in her children the imprint of everything she had tried to give them: the caution, the closeness, the unspoken pact to look out for one another. When trouble stirred, as it inevitably did, they knew how to signal without speaking, how to position themselves near allies, how to endure scrutiny without revealing too much. These skills did not make them safe, but they made them less alone, and that mattered. The plantation itself aged around them, buildings sagging, owners changing, overseers replaced, but the structure of power remained stubbornly intact, grinding on without regard for the lives it consumed. The mother grew older too, her body bearing the marks of decades of labor, her movements slower, her strength measured now not in speed but in endurance. She was no longer at the center of the plantation's attention, and in that invisibility there was a strange kind of mercy. It allowed her to observe, to advise, to intervene quietly when she could, passing along hard-earned knowledge to younger women who would face their own impossible choices. In moments of stillness, she allowed herself to imagine futures she would never see, futures where her children might live beyond this place, where the third child's fate, whatever it had been, had led somewhere freer than here. She did not romanticize these visions. They were fragile, uncertain, but they gave shape to hope that did not depend on immediate evidence. Toward the end of her life, as her body weakened and her days shortened, the weight she carried did not lift, but it did settle into something like understanding. She saw that what she had done that night in 1839 had not been about choosing one child over another, but about confronting a system that forced mothers into cruelty and then called it nature. She saw that her story was not unique, that countless women before and after her had been cornered into similar decisions, their love distorted by violence they did not create. And she understood, finally, that survival itself was not a moral failure, even when it demanded unbearable sacrifice. When she lay resting in the cabin in her final years, her children, now grown, sat near her, unaware of the full weight of the history she carried, but shaped by it all the same. She listened to their voices, steady and alive, and felt a quiet affirmation that the choice she had been forced to make had mattered, even if it would always hurt. The plantation would never acknowledge her strength, never record her loss, never speak the truth of that night, but history does not belong only to ledgers and laws. It lives in the lives that continue despite them, in the love that refuses to disappear even when the world demands it. This story ends not with peace, but with persistence, with a mother who endured, with children who lived, and with a memory that insists on being remembered, because forgetting is what systems like slavery depend on most. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you pause or ache or reflect, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you don't miss these untold histories, and leave a comment sharing how deeply this story affected you. Because these lives were real, these choices were forced, and remembering them is one way we refuse to let their suffering fade into silence.